So cool to see those families taking that step to publicly say, I want to raise my kids to follow Jesus. So great to see the faces of those COVID, maybe slightly pre-COVID babies. I'm sure there'll be some more coming. And so cool as a town to be able to surround them in that journey and say, you know, we're going to help you raise your kids to follow Jesus. Very exciting. Today's March 14th. It has now been just over a year since in-person services shut down here at Town and Field. A year ago was the first non-in-person service. Isn't that crazy, a year? I don't know about you guys. I remember exactly where I was a year ago yesterday, Friday the 13th, March 13th, 2020. The night before, Thursday night, schools in my province had shut down, and I'm like, that's crazy. I'm thinking, like, where was that when I was in junior high? I'd have loved that. But my wife had a speaking engagement, or Taliesin had a speaking engagement out of town, and so we were going as a family. So we got in the van, put our little 2-year-old daughter in the back, like in the car seat, not in the trunk, and we started driving, and we were getting updates, and I'm thinking, this thing's gonna get canceled. I mean, there are gonna be hundreds of people there. How could they possibly be doing this thing? But I'm like, well, we gotta keep driving because we don't know what's going on. She's the speaker. About 4.5 or 5 hours into the drive, we got the phone call. It said, event's canceled. And we're like, all right. So pulled a U-turn right then and there and drove 5 hours back. So spent the whole day driving. It's crazy that it's been a year. This world and this life, we live it like, you know, we're going to live forever and that everything is going to be the same forever and nothing will ever change. And it's so dependable. But this world, our lives are very inconsistent and undependable. They're fragile and things can change in a moment. So much can change. Can you believe it's been a little over a year? And who knows, start to see some hope of some things wrapping up, and we have no idea. And we have no idea what the future holds. James writes about this. He says, you don't know what you're going to do tomorrow. Your life is like a mist. It appears for a while, and you know, it's all in God's hands. I'm so grateful to be journeying through the book of Matthew, learning about a king. And one of my favorite things about this King Jesus is how consistent and dependable and unchanging he is. In a world that is so uncertain, he is certain. I love that. This is a kingdom that cannot be shaken, as the author of Hebrews says. So beautiful, so powerful. Listen, we're kicking off this series through the Gospel of Matthew. Gospel, again, I'll offer that definition again. The working definition we have here at Town and Field is the gospel is the good news that Jesus gave his life to restore a broken world, inviting us into a relationship with him and to participate in his kingdom. So Jesus gave his life, both in death and his life, his teaching. We're going to read through all of that to bring restoration to this broken world, and he invites us into that restorative work. And he invites us through that restoration, he invites us into a relationship with him and also to participate in his kingdom. That's what we want to be looking at. What does it look like to participate in this kingdom of Jesus, this not normal kingdom? This kingdom is anything but normal. In these first 3 weeks, working through Matthew chapter 1, through the genealogy, where it says kind of the origin story, the backstory of Jesus, is laying a foundation for this whole series. So each of these weeks isn't like a, hey, go do this thing, but it's maybe something to be thinking about as we frame where we're going to be headed for a while. And right now we're talking about COVID. Who knows, in a year and a half or 2 years or whatever, when we're like done this series, we're going to be a different church. We're going to live at a different time, and who knows what the world will look like. But right now we have this cool moment in COVID to think about kind of the inconsistency or the fragility of life and see what that might mean for our future. So for these 3 weeks, we're focusing on these 3 sets in the genealogy. And the first week, I challenged you guys. I said, part with normal, participate in the kingdom. What I'm saying is, I think we've kind of developed this idealized sense of what the church used to be like. Like, I just can't wait to get back to normal, as though that was so good. And I argued last week that COVID hasn't been the thing that's dismantled faith practice in North America in the 21st century or across the world. But I think it's actually a thing that's exposed some of the cracks and the faults in the foundation of what we were doing. Now, I love the church. It's been fun, and I've had a lot of great experiences growing up, but I've just come to realize over the years, even pre-COVID, that maybe we're not quite getting what Jesus has been calling us to, and this might be a moment for us to return. That trailer we showed earlier, it's on our social media. It's actually interesting. There's a comment that came in from someone. I have no idea who he is. And I'm sure it was well-meaning, but he said, you know, the old normal, it was fine. And he actually went on to say, get a different job and start perpetuating this idea that there was something wrong with the old normal. And I actually agree with him. The old normal was fine. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that in the church, and I don't mean Town of Field or specific, the church global, is that things were fine. They were comfortable. We enjoyed it. We would go to events. We'd do all these things. It's good. There's a lot of good stuff coming out of that. But I think we became comfortable and kind of plateaued and just content with that, rather than continually asking ourselves, are we in a powerful movement of participating in the kingdom of Jesus? Or we're just kind of coasting? Because if we step back and took an honest look at where we're at, we would see, well, attendance in the world is declining. Attendance at church is declining. Our participation, our commitment to the mission of Jesus, kind of the way that we live that out, how we participate in reading the book, how we pray, all these, our practices of faith don't seem that strong outside of kind of the events and the programs of the institution of church. And that's concerning. Actually, have been visiting some different community groups in Town and Field over Zoom over the last little while. It's been really cool to get to see some people, because I don't get to otherwise. And one guy said this, and I loved it. It stood out to me a lot. He's like, yeah, it's really interesting that pre-COVID, I'd always hear in churches, people say, we're the body of Christ. It's a people, not the building. He's like, but now that COVID's hit, he's like, it feels like, it's like, oh, no, wait, actually we were a building. Now, there's nothing wrong with buildings and programs and events and all that, but I wonder if sometimes we become so captivated by that they become the main thing, rather than Jesus being the main thing that informs the events or the gatherings that we have. I'm speaking to myself here too. It's been easy to get wrapped up in this normal. And I would argue that this idea of the good old days of the church, I would say that they're old days, and there were some great things and some really cool things that Jesus was up to, but I think that this is a new day, and right here in the middle of COVID, we have an opportunity to look forward to the promised land that Jesus is taking us to, as we have a moment to reassess in the middle of this disruption, this disturbance, to say, you know what, I think there might be something more. I think we could realign ourselves with the mission of Jesus just a little bit more. And this week, again, I want to challenge you with that same idea. Part with normal, participate in the kingdom. Now I'm talking about letting go of the idea of the old normal, and so it's like, oh, we just got to get back to normal. That's what's going to save us. That's what's going to change us. And I want to focus on an idea of how I believe we often normalize our lives in our practice and pursuit of faith, which I think if we continue to do that will return us to the old normal. And I think we need to escape from that type of normalization. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the continued genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, the second chunk of 14 generations. And this genealogy is so fascinating. I mean, I just want to talk for hours about it, but I'm going to keep my time short, especially now that we're digital. But Matthew's really trying to highlight this idea that he opens up with in verse 1, where he says that this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, or the Christ. This means, we defined this last week, Messiah or Christ means chosen one. He is the one. This is the coming king that's been promised. And God promised that it would be a descendant of Abraham, and so we see it first generation start with Abraham, and also it would be a descendant of the great King David. Now I want to catch you guys up on the narrative that we went over last week. So last week we kind of talked, God created everything, it was good. People were struggling to follow God, they went away from him, so God shows up and he says, okay, Abraham, out of your life, or out of your family, I'm going to bring this chosen one, this Messiah, this person who will save, will redeem, will restore the world, will rescue them in their time of need. And then out of Abraham births this nation called Israel. And the Old Testament is primarily about following this nation called Israel and how God is trying to express himself through that nation. Now they find themselves enslaved in Egypt, and then eventually God rescues them from Egypt because he's in the midst of he's in the business of rescuing his people. But the journey seems to be like one disruption or disturbance to another, whether it's, and typically those are because of their own sin and their own waywardness, but regardless of what it is, there's a disruption, disturbance, and it's this challenging thing, and they continue to struggle to set their eyes on God rather than saying, God, we just surrender to you. Last week I focused on how they're wandering through the wilderness, and they would look back to the old normal of slavery in Egypt and be like, we just want to go back there, and they're idealizing the past, remembering it for something that it wasn't. Eventually God brings them to Canaan, they take over Canaan, it becomes their promised land. And God was their king. It was a theocracy. That was the political system it was, where a divine being is the king. But the people say to God, hey, listen, we just want like a human king. We want to be a monarchy. So eventually God relents. And the first king of the nation of Israel is this king named Saul. Saul did some great things, but then later on in his life, he became a little bit of a train wreck. And then eventually the throne gets taken by arguably the greatest king in the history of Israel, and his name is David. And that's where this genealogy picks up. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Now, I just want to make a couple comments as we go through this genealogy. We now pick up, we're at King David. Now, this genealogy is interesting. It includes people of all ethnicities, or not all, a bunch of different ethnicities, different socioeconomic classes, different vocations, men, women, which was very controversial to order a genealogy having women and some of the people of disrepute and like some of the different vocations and ethnicities back when Matthew's writing this. But it paints this picture of inclusivity in this kingdom of Jesus. So you don't have to be this or that. However, this chunk here is going to follow the kings that descend from David. So David was the father of Solomon. Check this out. Whose mother had been Uriah's wife. That's weird. Why was his son Solomon, but it was another man's wife's son? Well, I'm sure a lot of you know the story, but David, great man, the Bible describes him as a king after God's own heart. Or a man after God's own heart. And he was great. But like all of us, he had his imperfections and his slip-ups, and he had a huge slip-up. Saw his girl, and he's like, yeah, man, I'm into that. He knows that she's married to someone, but he gets her over to his place. He sleeps with her, finds out she's pregnant, has her husband killed in battle to try to cover it up. Actually, that psalm that Sarah opened the service with and prayed from, Psalm 51, is this beautiful psalm of this deep conviction and repentance and confession out of this narrative where David's like, man, I've really messed up. And he calls out to God for mercy and compassion, which God gives to him. So David was king number 2 of Israel. And then he was the father of Solomon, who becomes the king. Then Solomon, the father of Rehoboam. Now check this out. This is something that, since most of us in the North American church don't read our Bibles, most people don't know this, but it's actually a huge part of the historical narrative of the nation of Israel. Man, I could just spend hours. I love this narrative. It's so rich. But I want to zero in on this, because this is actually something significant that happens in the historical narrative that a lot of people don't really know. What happens is there's David, or King Saul, then King David, then Solomon. After Solomon builds the temples, pretty great king until the end. Things get a little sketchy. He has a son named Rehoboam. And under Rehoboam's rule, the kingdom actually goes through like a civil war and splits. Now we have northern kingdom of Israel and southern kingdom of Judah. And the northern kingdom of Israel becomes ruled by a guy named Jeroboam, who goes down as a very evil king. You can read 1 Samuel through 2 Kings, and you'll get all this narrative in there. And Jeroboam is like iconically evil. Rehoboam, not a very good king. They split the kingdom, and from there on out, it's this divided kingdom, 2 different nations out of this civil war. And now it's going to go through some generations of kings. It's going to skip a couple. It's actually go include a bunch of kings who are really great and some kings who are really not so great. And go like this. Rehoboam, the father of Abijah. Abijah, the father of Asa. Asa, the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, the father of Jehoram. Jehoram, the father of Uzziah. Uzziah, the father of Jotham. Jotham, the father of Ahaz. Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. Side note, personal favorite, Hezekiah, so good. Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. Manasseh, the father of Amon. Amon, the father of Josiah. And Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. So they've come out of slavery in Egypt, and they get to this point where they come into the promised land. And what you see here is this decline from when they take the promised land until they decline until the point where they actually get exiled by the nation Babylon. I want to share a story with you guys from my past. When I was in high school, or more specifically grade 10, I remember a friend of mine, he gave me a cassette tape. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's kind of like a sample of Spotify on like a plastic cartridge. And it was this cassette tape of this band called MXPX. And I'd never heard of this. I mostly just heard some songs on the radio and whatever my parents listened to at home. And I remember taking it home, and I was staying in my dad's truck. I put it in my dad's truck, and all of a sudden, my friend said, it's this type of music called punk rock. And I was like, well, I've never heard of that. So I put it in, and all of a sudden, this blast of volume and energy, and in my mind, just glorious goodness started blasting out of the speakers. And I was like, I have arrived. I'm home. I've made it to the promised land. It changed my life. I was like, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard. And because of that, I started finding out there were more of these bands, these punk rock bands. They weren't like really big and known. It was kind of like a subset. And so I started digging into it, and I started just like listening to all these cool bands like that. And what I discovered too is that there's actually a subculture called like kind of the punk rock scene or the punk rock movement. And as I started to discover, I realized these people look really different than other people. They dress really differently. They live kind of outside of the norms. of the world, and I became very intrigued. I was like, I like it. I like that it's so different, and this music's full of energy, and it took over my life. Now, what I loved about the punk rock movement is that it didn't care about the norms. In fact, it was like anti-norm. It was like anti-conformity. It was like non-conformist. And I was like, that's great. I don't want to be normal. I don't want to just be like the crowd. I don't want to just do what everyone else is doing. I don't want to follow the man, so to speak. So I got into this, and over time I realized that a lot of my decisions actually would be like really fueled by over here would be conformity, so I would do the opposite. And I came to this realization at one point that I was like, you know what, I'm a conformist. I'm just a different kind of conformist. See, being a non-conformist that's kind of ruled by the invisible law of the norm or conformity is really being governed by the same rule or principle that conformists are ruled by. So being anti-mainstream is kind of being governed by that same idea. It's just doing the other. And I came to this hard realization that I was like, I'm kind of just part of the same thing. Rejecting the mainstream just puts me in something called the minor stream, I guess. I think that's a made-up word, but I realized it is, in a sense, a type of conformity. You see, in all cultures and all societies and all parts of the world, we have these kind of invisible laws, these norms, these kind of mainstream or conformity type thing that are these principles around how we should act and speak and do, and people judge you and perceive one another through that, and we find our value in that. And some aspects of that are good, some are maybe a little neutral, and some aren't good. I realized I just wasn't as punk rock as I thought I was. But what was cool for me is when I started reading about Jesus, I realized that Jesus was the most punk rock person who ever walked the earth. Now, maybe that sounds like a weird statement, and you're not tracking with me on this punk rock thing, but what happened was Jesus showed up, and Jesus was so weird. He was weirder than like the most punk rock of my friends. He was strange. He was not normal. He was abnormal. He came, and people were expecting a certain type of king, and he was so different. People would expect him to teach a certain way. He'd teach completely differently. And the reason that he was so punk rock, or he was so different, he was so strange, wasn't because he was conformist or non-conformist, not because he's part of the mainstream or rejecting that. It was because he showed up and he just ignored the invisible law, the invisible code of conduct, the invisible cultural and societal norms that people were being called to and drawn to and ordering their lives around. And he just lived on this mission called the gospel, his good news. He established his kingdom. He said, this is a new set of rules. This rules above all of that. This ignores all of that. This supplants all of that. There might be crossover at certain points, and there might not be. It's going to look weird because this is a whole new way of living. This is the not normal kingdom. And I think this is really hard for us. I think this is a serious barrier to entry for many of us into kingdom living, myself included. I struggle with this so much. It's that as humans, we are so set on kind of like cultural and relational homeostasis. What I mean by that is we work hard to try to normalize to those around us, to be accepted, to deal with our insecurities, to find value, to fulfill our own desires. And that makes it very hard for us to just surrender our wills to Jesus when we're being governed by an entirely different principle. We say Jesus is king, but so often the king is what the culture and the world dictates and pressures us into. And we're not alone in that struggle. This whole chunk of genealogy that we just read is like a serious narrative around the normalization of a nation and how it brought them into decline and it brought them to their next disruption. See, at the end of this genealogy, they end up being exiled by Babylon. That means Babylon comes in and destroys them, takes a bunch of them away, leaves some of them there. They've been imperialized. And this happened to the nation of Israel about 140 years before it happened to these guys. And that's what happened when they failed to live in God's kingdom and trust Him. They went to their own ways and they were normalized by the culture around them. And I'll give you a few examples from this narrative. So I'll step a little bit before David. We were talking about the Exodus when people were wandering in the wilderness. And many of you guys might know the story if you've been in the church for a while. While they're wandering in the wilderness, Moses goes up on the mountain to meet with God. And God is giving him these stone tablets with some of the laws that the people could live by. While he's up there, the people actually built a golden calf. And they started to worship a statue of a golden calf. And they actually were saying, this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. Now, if you're reading that, you're like, okay, chronologically, that doesn't actually make sense. You guys came out of Egypt and then you built the golden calf. Ironically, Moses is up on the mountain, two of the laws he's getting are have no other gods before me and don't make any idols. And people are down there making this statue. And we read that, we're like, that's crazy. Who worships a golden calf? None of us would do that. You might be watching in your house right now and you're like hiding your golden calf. You're like, no, I would never. We're going to do that? That's weird. But it's not that weird. And check this out. This is why. They had just lived for centuries in Egypt, dominated by Egyptian culture. And now they've come out and now they're journeying toward Canaan and they're surrounded by Canaan and other nations. Do you want to know one of the most common ways to honor a deity in both ancient Egyptian and Canaanite culture? It was to build a statue of a calf or a bull to iconify them and to worship them. This is a very normal. See, Israel didn't go off the deep end. What Israel had done was they had just adapted the worship and the culture and the lifestyle of those around them rather than just relying entirely on God, rather than obeying God's law. Rather than letting God's law transcend, they tried to juxtapose and fit some of it into what culture around them was doing. And they adopted that. And this idea of normalization continues on. Like I said, when they get to Canaan, God's supposed to be their king, but they say, no, we want a king. And in fact, you can read in 1 Samuel where they say, we just want to be like the other nations around us. They have kings. They've got a flesh and blood king. Come on, why can't we have someone like that? Why can't we just have someone sitting on the throne? And so God says, all right, gives them Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And we see this continue on. Lots of these kings struggle with this. And over time, what happens is the influences of the world around them, and even within their own context, continue to seep in and take their eyes off of what God is calling them to. David's battle with lust is saying, I just want that. I just want what the world has to offer. His son Solomon, great king, known for his incredible wisdom, which is funny because his son's kind of known for the exact opposite. But he's known for his incredible wisdom. He wrote parts of scripture. What happens later on in his life? Well, this dude, Solomon, if you don't know who he is, he's one of the wisest, most powerful, richest. He's the most ballin' king ever. He has more money than you, he has more power than you'll ever have. He had more sex than anybody ever had. He had hundreds and hundreds of wives. That's how you pluralize it. And toward the end of his life, he's taking on more and more wives. He has got hundreds. And that's the issue isn't the wives, but the issue is that they're bringing in different ideas and they're saying, well, here's the idol, here's the God from our culture. And what happens is it wraps him up and he takes his eyes off of God and he normalizes into those cultural norms and he is governed by something that is less than what God offers. And this continues to be the struggle throughout the time until the decline. And God tells his people, I'll protect you, I'll take care of you, I've got enough of you, my kingdom's great. But you need to trust me, you need to live for me. You need to follow my commands. You need to follow my teachings. And that's what Jesus is going to say. He's going to say, my kingdom's awesome. I have everything you need. You need nothing else. I'm giving you eternal hope. I'm inviting you into a relationship with me. You can participate in my kingdom. The reality is, and it's sad, I know right now that there are many of us, as we spend the next couple of years journeying through this, we'll read it, we'll hear it, and we'll ultimately do very little with it. And we won't decide to make Jesus king. I think it's so easy for us to say, well, my neighbors have that, or they live like that, and I just want to have that. Or it's so easy for us to take even slogans we have in the church, we often say, be in the world, but not of the world. And that's usually just a way for us to justify acting however we want and just having Jesus as a side dish. We don't want to be mocked. We don't want to be persecuted. We don't want people to think we're weird. I do this all the time. Out of insecurity, I want to be liked, and I don't want people to think I'm crazy. I don't want people to think I'm weird. I'm following a king who's pretty weird. He's not normal, yet I don't want people to think I'm weird. I need to stop caring about that. I need to stop trying to normalize what's going on around me. I need to stop trying to normalize to the world and realize that Jesus has something so much better on offer. I need to part with normal and participate in the kingdom. This pattern continues on throughout the kings of Judah here. And they continue to adapt false worship and false God from the cultures around them. They start taking on these different gods and these different deities as though the God that created the universe, as though the God that brought them out of slavery in Egypt, as though the God that brought them to the land flowing with milk and honey, as though the God who provided for them time and time again in the wilderness wasn't enough. They turned to other gods. And these other gods aren't just alternatives. They're terrible alternatives. Many of them include grotesque and horrible forms of worship. Some of them, their worship includes like prostitution and illicit sex. Some of them even include things like sacrificing your children to them. And for some reason, the people of Judah turned from God to that. And we read that and we're like, that's crazy. I think that's what we often do. And I think that's one of the reasons we've arrived with a pretty weak, mediocre form of faith in the modern day church. We're pretty lukewarm. We've plateaued a pretty long time ago, I think. As a movement, as a collective, as a people. You might say, I didn't. But as a people, I think we have, and we need to take this call seriously together. You might say, well, we're not like engaging in like worship with like prostitutes, with prostitution as part of it, or sacrificing our children. But check this out. I think there are actually some interesting parallels in the Old Testament. Throughout the Old Testament, prostitution is used as a metaphor for like worshiping other gods, worshiping the things of this world, taking our eyes off of God. It's essentially, prostitution is essentially trading in the real for a cheap substitute. And that's what God uses to describe what happens when we pursue the things of the world rather than pursuing Him, rather than trusting Him, rather than pursuing His kingdom. I think we do that all the time. We live the American dream. We want what everyone else has. We want to enjoy the same things. Is it bad to enjoy things in life? No, not at all. And actually, I think that's what the kingdom of Jesus is about, as a king who came and said, do you want true enjoyment? Because I will give you greater fulfillment than anything that this world could ever offer. But as long as we keep our eyes more focused on what the world has to offer, we're going to miss it. Or the nation sacrificing their children to false gods. I mean, what a horrible picture. Yet, what are we putting on display for our kids, for the next generation? That might seem like a pretty stark contrast to you, but seriously, we're handing them this really cheap, weak, Americanized, Canadianized faith that's devoid of its mission, that isn't really about what Jesus taught. Jesus came and lived in crazy, extreme, radical ways. He ignored the invisible rules of this world. He ignored the normal, and He created something so much better, and He invites us into it. The next generation is looking up to us to be an example of that. Are we going to show them what it looks like to actively participate in the kingdom of Jesus? And their pursuit of the world, of these false gods, eventually got Judah into serious trouble, where they're exiled by this nation, Babylon. What does God do? Because He's so caring and kind and compassionate and loving and full of grace. He looks at them and says they need to be rescued. So He sends this great King, Jesus. He comes in flesh to teach us this new way of life, to teach us what it looks like to be in relationship with Him and to participate in His kingdom because of the good news of what He has done. This is great news, but it's going to require us to stop normalizing, to part with normal and participate in the kingdom, to stop just trying to fit in and be liked and be comfortable and do all these things. Following Jesus is tough. Jesus' life and ministry, we're going to read, came with a lot of sacrifices. If you think we're going to read this text and study it, and it's not going to require big changes in our lives, all of us, if we want to participate in the kingdom that Jesus is describing here, it is going to require like wholesale changes in our lives. Crazy stuff. To be a part of His kingdom is a whole new way of living. Like I said earlier, we often want to have like side dish Jesus. Like you walk into the cafeteria and your plate's so full of food, so you're just like, maybe a little Jesus on the side or drizzle Him on top. Jesus wants to take that plate away and give you a new plate. He's the plate, He's the food on it, He's the feast, and it's so much better. And when you truly start to experience that, what happens is you look around the cafeteria and you realize, oh my goodness, what I was eating before is garbage compared to this. What the world has to offer me only leads me to the next disruption in my life, only leads me toward Babylon, only leads me toward exile. It leads me away from the kingdom of Jesus. Jesus is either king or He's not. You can think, okay, I'm going to live a really normalized North American life, and I'm also going to follow Jesus. It's not a both and, it's either or. Jesus calls us to lay down our lives and follow Him. This Jesus is unlike any king. One of the things that's so abnormal about him is when he showed up, people were expecting this Messiah. They're expecting this Christ. And they're like, he's going to come with like power and dominion. He's going to set up this big kingdom. He's going to be richer than Solomon. He's going to be more like a mightier warrior than David. He's going to rule forever. He's going to do all these things. He's going to change everything. And what happens is that this simple child shows up, as we're going to see a little bit later in the narrative, shows up and he's born in a feeding box for animals. And rather than ruling with like authority and dominion and wealth and the self-sought glory that the kings of the world and our politicians and our leaders so often crave and want out of their roles, Jesus shows up full of compassion, humility. He's here to serve others. Rather than demanding respect and servitude, Jesus takes on the role of a servant, and he does things like washes his friends' filthy feet. He hangs out with kids and loves on them. He gives time to people. He acts with compassion and care, never wavering from the mission. This mission has nothing to do with normal. This mission calls us to a new way of living in the true kingdom of Jesus. I learned a long time ago that Jesus is by far the most punk rock person who's ever lived, and maybe that's not a selling point for you. Probably it isn't for most of you guys. That is to say, the greatest compliment out of my life would be like, Jesus iconifies what it looks like to be a hero. Jesus iconifies what it looks like to be the leader of a movement. We look around at the heroes that we know. Maybe you watch like superhero movies. Those superheroes in movies are weird characters. They're not normal people. They're people who live outside of the normal and do significant things. And even our real life heroes. I mean, you think about like civil rights activists, or you think about like Mother Teresa, or even heroes in church history. You think about like William Tyndale or Athanasius. None of these people are normal, and we think their stories are so great. We're like, oh, Martin Luther King is so great, or Mother Teresa was so great. But don't ask me to live like them. That's crazy. I want my comfortable, normalized life where people just look at me like a normal person, where I fit in. Maybe for you, the expression of your faith is the area that you're trying to normalize a lot to fit in. Maybe you go to school and you're like, I don't want to be made fun of. Maybe it's a Monday and your friends are like, what'd you do on the weekend? And you're like, it's homework, just chilled at home. When really you were at youth. You were at a gathering around figuring out who this Jesus is and what it looks like to follow him. That was me. I struggled with that, and I wish I could go back to my high school years. One of the greatest mission fields you'll ever have is your school. I wish I would have just stopped focusing on normalizing and fitting in and trying to make sure people thought highly of me and liked me. I used to lie about what school I went to in high school because I went to a Christian school and I was too embarrassed to talk about it. I just wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be mocked. Maybe that's you at your workplace. Maybe you're embarrassed to invite someone to come check out one of our services. I've been saying, who you bring in? Maybe you're embarrassed. Maybe you're too scared. Maybe you're timid. Maybe you don't want to share some of our stuff on social media from Town and Field Church because it'll mess up your grid, or what will people think, or maybe you'll lose a social media friend, or I don't know. You just don't want people to associate you with other people who they've seen as Christians or as other. It is time for us to let go of all of that, to part with normal and participate in the kingdom, and say, Jesus, you, the chosen one, the Messiah, the one who descended from Abraham, the one who came out of the great King David, the true King who comes with humility, compassion, grace, and love. You, Jesus, the true King, who looked at your people when they were struggling in the wilderness, who looked at your people when they were enslaved in Egypt, who looked at your people after they'd been exiled by Babylon, who patiently put up with your people as they continued to choose idols and false gods over you. Say, Jesus, you are the true King. Be the King of my life. And as we study the teachings and the way of Jesus, his life, we say, Jesus, I surrender. What you call me to, I will go. I will let go of normal. I will stop trying to normalize my life, and I will live a significant life in the kingdom, making a real difference for you. We've been invited to join God in restoring all things. And the first step is this, to make Jesus King of our lives. Maybe you've been struggling with this idea of normalization. It's time to part with normal and participate in the kingdom. Love you guys so much. We'll see you next week.